as a journalist trying to cover this patch, what are the obstacles you face? Because this is obviously a long-running story which doesn't always have immediate impact unless there are floods and fires. So how difficult do you find it as a journalist to cover?
The problem with journalism in general at the moment is that it's become extraordinarily difficult to engage with policymakers in any government department, in any public institution, in the way that one used to. We used to phone up the Home Office and ask for a briefing with officials, and nearly always we'd get one. Nowadays, when you ring up any government department and ask for detailed engagement about policy, you'll be told, can you submit some questions in an email? When they know that you're right on deadline, they'll issue with an extraordinarily bland statement, which will say, this government is determined to do the very best it can. We have a tremendous gap between engaged media, or an impossibility of engaging as journalists and try and raise issues with people who make decisions is really difficult.
It's down to the media to tell these stories, and I think what David's really indicating is that even at a corporate level, the access to information is being withheld unless you're playing the game. This is like a massive capture. In that way, same with the ecological crisis. The leaders aren't dealing with the issues.
The first report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the first major set of reports, came out in 1990. That's 3 decades ago. So even the climate progressive countries have fundamentally failed to address their emissions in the last 30 years, despite the fact we've had lots of rhetoric around this.
So David, I'm wondering about your thoughts as a chief scientific advisor to the government on how receptive governments are to that kind of advice. And also, I think that you've also, in addition to trying to advise on climate change, you have previously also tried to advise governments on pandemics.
There was a very big difference between working for the government from 2000 to 2008 and then working for the government from 2013 to 2017. And basically that difference was the austerity budget. During the period when I was chief scientific advisor, we ran a big program of work on flood and coastal defences for the United Kingdom. We simply said, on the basis of the best models that we have today, a very big part of the United Kingdom would be under severe flood risk. We began a program of investing in managing flood risk downwards. And this was a successful program. 2010, that funding was completely drawn back to a level that it was at before that report I produced was made. And if I now say to you, the floods of 2012-13, the worst in our history, were what we were predicting back in 2002, 2003, loss and damage was about £500 million. If we had not put in place that program, my belief is it would have been closer to £100 billion, right? So there is an expenditure that manages to save money, and yet the expenditure was cut back. It's the same with COVID-19, and I believe a report into government that has not been made public in 2016 indicated already that our hospitals would not be ready for an epidemic of this kind.
The problem here is that we have this resistance to sensible policies like this, like a carbon tax, because of the threat that it poses to GDP growth, which is one of the reasons why, effectively so far, we've not done anything meaningful when it comes to climate policy. That's exactly the same fear, incidentally, that prevented our government from acting more quickly on the COVID-19 crisis.
I mean, I got a piece of information 2 days ago, but it was only shared anecdotally. It was a woman who is in the press office of the government, and she has been given on a regular basis press releases from the chief medical officer calling for changes in response to this COVID crisis, and Boris at the last minute has pulled them. Dr. Rupert Reed and I and a person from the Lancet and others wrote an article saying that we believe the precautionary principle wasn't being followed with regard to this COVID crisis. On the fact that the British government are the biggest subsidisers of fossil fuels in Europe seems to me like a bigger agenda to focus on.
So we know that this is a time when people are not paying enough attention to the environment and sort of, focus on one crisis, ignoring the other.
Carbon capture and storage is a fig leaf for the fossil fuel industry if we're not careful. That's all.
We are already seeing institutional bias towards those technologies and away from mitigation, whether that's in the IPCC and mitigation scenarios, whether it's in the Committee on Climate Change's Net Zero report. We're seeing that at the global level, that there is already a reliance on these technologies that do not exist, which is allowing us already to not put in place the mitigation, the carbon reduction approaches we need to use today, both technically and socially. So whilst I'm fully in favour of the technologies, but it is already being used as an excuse for inaction on difficult issues today.
There was a report a few years ago called Thinking the Unthinkable, which was that politicians and business leaders were unable to think about crises. That's a really significant thing for a report to conclude, that unable to think about crises. These are the people that are in charge of democratic outcomes and policy making. We've already heard that Professor Rockström from the Potsdam Institute has said that around half of the world's going to die if, as came out this panel, we're heading for 3 to 4 degrees of warming. Half the world's going to die. And it just beggars belief that we're not going to take proper action to deal with that. But the problem is our democracies have been captured to vested interests, and we have an economic system that's geared to kill life on Earth.